After being translated into 37 languages and selling over 15 million copies worldwide, The Witcher Saga has become one of the most popular mainstream fantasy book series, and the lovable, sarcastic, cynical monster hunter Geralt of Rivia has become a household name. Although the series has gained a massive amount of success with multiple popular adaptations, people tend to overlook its cultural importance, especially the significance it holds for Central and Eastern Europeans. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, hi, I'm Anna, the Transylvanian villager, and this is Read and Play, the series where I review fantasy books while playing video games. So if you're into that, please consider subscribing. In this video duology, I would like to discuss the cultural importance of the Witcher Saga, and in order to do so, we have to take a look at the book series written by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, as well as the game adaptation made by CD Projekt separately. Throughout this series, I will use the phrase Central and Eastern Europe as a term encompassing the countries of Central Europe, the Baltics, Eastern Europe, and Southeastern Europe, also called the Balkans, meaning the former communist states from the Eastern Bloc and Warsaw Pact in Europe. In the gameplay, I'm gonna go through the main quests of the first chapter of the third Witcher game, so stay tuned for an epic playthrough. But sorry for the low quality, I'm practically playing on a potato. But before we jump into that, I would like to fill your heads with some random information about the homeland of the author, Poland, because that is what we do on this channel. Contrary to popular beliefs, Poland isn't an Eastern European country, but it is in Central Europe. It's Europe's 9th largest country, which includes some beautiful beaches, mountains, deserts and forests, as well as some stunningly beautiful cities, such as Warsaw, which during World War II was almost completely destroyed and later on rebuilt. The name of the country originates from the Polani tribe, which means people living in open fields, and it is the home of the world's largest castle, one of Europe's oldest restaurants, and it blessed us with the invention of latex condoms. Not to mention that one of the most iconic figures of the history of science, Marie Curie, was also Polish. So without further ado, let's dissect this series. Before he started his career as a science fiction translator, Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski studied economics and worked as a senior sales representative for a foreign trade company. In 1986, he submitted a short story titled The Witcher to the Polish SFF magazine Fantastica, at the request of his son, who was a huge fan of the publication. The story received an enormous amount of success, both from the readers and critics, and so a cycle of tales was born, including 2 short story collections and 6 novels. But what made this series so successful? In a world devastated by monsters and wars, the book series tells the tale of a witcher named Geralt of Rivia, a cynical yet noble character who manages to maintain his unique code of ethics in a morally ambiguous universe. Witchers are people who have undergone extensive training, ruthless mental and physical conditioning, and mysterious rituals in order to become monster slayers for hire. The story is set in an intricate universe that combines elements of magic and science, which often appears in Central and Eastern European fantasy books, such as Monday Begins on Saturday by Russian authors Boris and Arkady Strugatsky, and the Lord of the Ice Garden series, written by Polish author Jaroslav Grzędowicz. The Witcher Saga also presents a set of complex and believable political conflicts, drawing inspiration from the history of Central and Eastern Europe. The novel has an overall engaging plot filled with humor, cynicism, and a dark form of realism, showing a world dominated by power hunger and self-serving narratives. The series is one of the best executions of grimdark fantasy, a subgenre of speculative fiction, which is often referred to as anti-Tolkienism, since it is set in a universe opposing Tolkien's idealism, yet still incorporates elements of Tolkien-esque fantasy. Grimdark fantasy follows a morally grey protagonist in a morally ambiguous universe through a morally questionable plot, where the line between heroes and villains is blurred, which is perfectly adapted in The Witcher. Another strong point of the series is the writing style, although that doesn't come off in every translation. The narrative is heavily dialogue-focused, which is something I usually don't like, but the author managed to pull it off and actually make it work. Sapkowski's writing style reflects elements of Central and Eastern European literature, being reminiscent of Nikolai Gogol's writing, and it plays with the characteristics of the most iconic style of Polish literature, Polish Romanticism, referencing the works of Polish Romantic poet and folklorist Roman Zmorski. Although both the plot and the world building are extremely well written, what makes this series so good is its character-driven narrative and the character dynamics, whether they are romantic, platonic, parental, or political. Each Each character has an elaborate backstory and a set of unique characteristics and realistic mannerisms. The main character, Geralt, became a fan favorite due to his realistically flawed nature. He is loyal and honest with a strong moral compass that is nearly impossible to maintain in such a cruel world. And he shows a lot of character growth, which is credited to his open-mindedness. But he has a bad habit of constantly complaining, being insecure about his identity, not to mention his lack of logical thinking, due to which most of his plans fail. Although on the surface he is arrogant and cynical, he is actually a loving and caring person with an overall endearing and realistic personality. Of course, this kind of character writing isn't unique, and it's popular worldwide in books, movies and comics, such as Hideaki Sorachi's protagonist, Sakata Gintoki from the Gintama series, who on a closer look heavily resembles Geralt. Sapkowski excels at writing character dynamics, which is mostly visible in the father-daughter-like relationship between Geralt and Ciri, which is best shown in the Sword of Destiny short story collection. Ciri is a former princess who is tied to Geralt by destiny and possesses an immense amount of magical power. Although their first meeting has a rough start, they quickly develop a fondness of each other that leads to a handful of adorable back and forth between the two. This makes their reunion in the short story titled Something More extremely heartwarming, which is low-key one of the best moments in the entire series. Although at the beginning their relationship seems to be nothing but the work of destiny, it grows into something much deeper over time and it becomes a key element of the series. But one of my absolute favorite things about this series are the female characters. What I find absolutely spectacular is that although the author fails to describe women without mentioning their breasts, he still manages to create some of the best female characters in the fantasy genre. Seeing strong, intelligent, powerful and influential women who fit the word badass in every shape and form really tickled my fancy, because as a woman from the Central and Eastern European area, this is the kind of characters I am familiar with from our myths, folktales and legends. Be that the princess warrior who fights on the battlefield by her husband, the clever daughter who outsmarts the king, the wife who saves her husband from the Valor Fairy, or the warrior who leads an army of 300 women against enemy soldiers. These are also the kind of women you would see in our history books or in today's political scene. It is unsurprising that Sapkowski managed to write such a great female cast, given that when he was asked about feminism in a 2017 interview, this is what he had to say. "I believe that the feminine element dominates in nature. Women are generally stronger than men. All power of this world should be in the hands of women. Life, the world are too serious to leave it in our hands." One flaw that often appears in mainstream fantasy is that powerful female characters are often written with more masculine traits, through which authors indirectly villainize femininity. Luckily, Sapkowski does the exact opposite of that, which is especially visible in Blood of Elves, a book that puts a lot of focus on Ciri's upbringing and being taught by sorceresses how to deal with various aspects of womanhood. One of the cutest instances of this is when Triss Merigold tells Ciri that women should only do things for their own self-confidence and not for the opinion of others. The most iconic character written by Sapkowski is a sorceress by the name of Yennefer, who on the surface seems cold, distant and arrogant, yet she is one of the most loving characters in the series. Throughout the story, we mostly see her through Geralt's eyes, thanks to their romantic relationship, and step by step we get to peek underneath that shallow appearance and strong surface to find someone who went through a great deal of trauma from childhood, yet managed to overcome all her difficulties and become one of the most powerful figures of this universe, who is also traditionally feminine and motherly. Presenting her as the strong, influential and terrifying woman at first, then introducing her tragic backstory later on, was a genius choice of storytelling, because given that we already got attached to her, finding out about the difficulties she had to go through hits harder. So another one of the main characteristics that makes this book relatable to Central and Eastern Europeans, both Slavic and non-Slavic people, is the character writing, the portrayal of femininity and the overall attitude of the characters, which hits closer to home for us than what we generally see in mainstream fantasy. Another fantasy subgenre The Witcher perfectly fits into is Slavic fantasy. Lately, I've seen many Western, especially British and American fans of the series, claiming that The Witcher isn't Slavic, discrediting the Central and Eastern European roots of the series, like the Nobel Prize Committee discredits all the major discoveries made by our scientists. And if you disagree with them, they will call you racist, nationalist, neo-Nazi, because, well, that's how Western people argue, I guess. Well, here's the problem. Aside from the painfully obvious anti-Polonism, Slavophobia, and the general anti anti-Eastern European sentiment that exists in the West, according to which everything that comes from Eastern or Central Europe is inherently wrong, and if you like it, you're automatically a bad person. The people who say that The Witcher isn't Slavic clearly don't know the definition of Slavic fantasy. And as a huge fan of this genre, I can quickly explain it to you. Slavic fantasy is a subgenre of speculative fiction which incorporates elements of the legends, myths, folklore, and history of Slavic countries into the general canons of fantasy literature. That doesn't mean that it can only contain elements of Slavic mythology. It means that it incorporates some of them. Clearly, this series contains a huge amount of Tolkienesque aspects, which is heavily based on Germanic, Celtic, Finnish, and Greek mythology, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a Slavic fantasy book, since it contains enough references to mostly Polish, but also East and South Slavic folklore. Obviously, if you don't know anything about the Slavic cultures, you won't see the Slavic elements. And I'm not just talking about the creatures like the Striga, vampires, Rusalka, Leshy, and Kikimora. Firstly, the word Witcher is the English rendering of the word Vedmak, a character from Old Slavic mythology who is a sorcerer that possesses a secret knowledge that he may use to heal or harm people, depending on his mood. The word used for Witcher in the original Polish version of the novels is Wiedźmin, which was coined by Sapkowski himself as a neologism, while the word Wiedźmak is a cognate of Vedmak that is used in the books only as a derogatory term for Witchers. The book also contains many retellings of iconic Polish legends, most notably the short story called The Little Sacrifice, which tells the same tale as the legend of Vars and Sava. The series references the legend of the Wawel dragon and the tale of Baba Yaga, and you can also find references to the legend of the two swords of the Teutonic Knights. Additionally, the Law of Surprise seems to be inspired by the Russian fairy tale called Vasilisa the Beautiful. Sapkowski's stories are also reminiscent of the works of Alexander Afanasiev, the Russian Slavist and ethnographer who published hundreds of Slavic, mainly Russian, fairy and folk tales. But more importantly, The Witcher incorporates events from the history of Slavic and other Central and Eastern European countries in a more realistic manner. The biggest flaw that many fantasy books have is the glorification of war, which, if you're from a country which has been a battleground over and over again for centuries, you might find it quite distasteful. The climax point of most epic and high fantasy books is a big battle scene where the hero shows a great amount of bravery, after which he becomes a living legend or falls in combat with grace. The Witcher shows a more realistic and unglorified version of war, drawing parallels to real historical events and tragedies, and often highlights that in war there is no such thing as an absolute winner, because war results in losses for both sides. The Witcher saga retells some of the most messed up parts of Central and Eastern European history and addresses the conflicts triggered by the ethnic tensions of this area. The ethnic disputes began around the 9th century when Central and Eastern Europe had a diverse population including Slavs, Khazars, Franks, Magyars, Avars, and the Kievan Rus. The story also references the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, including their main cavalry, the Winged Hussars, through the Nilfgaardian Black Knight with wings on his helmet. But we can also find references to the partitions of Poland, which resulted in the elimination of sovereign Poland and Lithuania. Later in history, the ethnic tension worsened with the rise of anti-Semitism and the anti-Roma sentiment, due to which the novel has some clear references to the pogroms which have occurred throughout Europe. In The Witcher, we can see this through the portrayal of the organized and often officially encouraged massacre or persecution of minorities such as dwarves or elves throughout the history of the continent. And in Time of Contempt, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact makes an appearance in the form of the Nilfgaard-Kaedwen alliance. We also have to consider when these books were published and what was happening in that era in Central and Eastern Europe. The first short story was published in 1986 before the fall of communism, which was the era of systemic oppression that left behind a massive amount of trauma on our people. Another major event going on during that era was the Yugoslav Wars. Due to that, many Central and Eastern European authors included anti-war themes, which became a strong element in Slavic fantasy as well. One of the best examples for that is the work of Serbian author Boban Knežević. In his historical fantasy novel Black Blossom, he condemns the repeated war crimes in Serbian history and presents a powerful social commentary applicable for that era. Similar themes appear throughout the Witcher series, reflecting the cruel reality of our history. Now, Though there's one questionable aspect of this series which triggered a few interesting discussions in the community, and that is the representation of ethnic minorities. Many people have pointed out that dwarves and elves seem to draw parallel to the history of Jewish and Roma people, and the fans from those communities have pointed out the weirdness of always being represented as non-human mythical creatures, which I can totally see. I get you, and I'm sorry you have to see this shit in fiction all the time. That aside, another important narrative in this series shows up in the attitude of people towards the Witchers. Until the fall of communism in Central and Eastern European countries, our world and cultures were widely inaccessible to the West. This isolation led to many speculations and misbeliefs created about us, which was amplified by the anti-communist Western propaganda that utilized the film industry, literature, and the mainstream media to create a false, villainized image of us. And sadly, that still appears in Western pop culture today, be that the portrayal of Central and Eastern European men as criminals, mobsters, and alcoholic, abusive, sexist assholes, as well as the women always being portrayed as sex workers, gold diggers, or victims who need the help of Western men.
I love American film. Giddy giddy bang bang, giddy giddy.
The Witcher often touches upon the topic of marginalization, which is visible in people's attitude towards Geralt. In some cases, he is villainized for no reason, and sometimes he is exoticized or fetishized. Sounds familiar? As someone whose job and hobbies heavily rely on interacting with people worldwide, I've faced the same situations over and over again, which made The Witcher for me painfully relatable. With that said, due to the character writing, the strong female cast, the cynicism, the humor, and the historical and cultural references, these books are a great representation of Central and Eastern Europe, which is something we rarely see in today's pop culture. To understand the importance of the Witcher series, we have to look underneath its vivid, colorful yet dark universe and see what it actually represents. Aside from drawing parallels to our history, following characters that feel real to us, and playing around with mixed elements of multiple cultures, it manages to stand its place in the publishing industry in a day and age when there's such a heavy push against non-Western authors. Although it's not a perfect 10 out of 10 series, I value its overall importance in the fantasy genre, which is why I feel it was unfair what they did with the Netflix adaptation. The series was clearly made with a Western audience in mind, watered down to suit the taste of Western viewers. They removed most parts of the plot which referenced Polish legends, such as A Little Sacrifice, which was based on the iconic Polish legend of Wals and Sava. They cut out the best short story, The Sword of Destiny, the one about Geralt and Ciri's first meeting, which is a defining moment in their relationship. And with that, they reduced the connection between them to nothing but destiny. They made every female character inherently unlikable, reduced the importance of some of them, and they changed the portrayal of femininity to suit a Western narrative. Not to mention Yennefer's complete character assassination.
And let's face it, you're a girl. We're just vessels.
And overall, they made everything look like all the basic Western Europe-inspired medieval fantasy that mixes elements of Celtic, Germanic, Norse, and in some rare cases, Mediterranean history and mythology. If that's what you like, there's nothing wrong with that. But there are hundreds upon hundreds of novels like that, like the Malazan series, First Love, Broken Empire, Red Queen's War, King Killers,
Stormlight Archive, Mistborn, Realm of the Elderlings, Lotlands, Gentlemen Bastards, Vicinius Trilogy, Empires of Dust, Articles of Fate, The Band, Raven's Blade, The Wolf of the North, Under the Northern Skies, The Fateful and the Fallen, Godblind, Book of the Ancestor,
and hundreds more. So if they wanted a replacement for Game of Thrones, they could have just chosen any of those and leave The Witcher up to someone who actually understands the cultural references in it. But enough about my opinions. What are your thoughts on this topic? Tell me in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up. I usually make videos about the literature and gaming related topics of this area because I feel like there's not enough content on YouTube about it. So if you're into that, please consider subscribing. Next time I'm gonna talk about the importance of the Witcher games, and I also have some interesting books lined up for review, such as Black Blossom and Monday Begins on Saturday, so if you don't want to miss those, you know what to do. Thanks for tuning in and have a great day.